Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. That bumper is a little squirrely.
Yeah, it's a little short notice, kind of.
Maybe we get in touch with Revolution Radio and have them fix that. Yeah, so we have a great show. It's a holiday edition, and we're going to be talking about one of the largest catastrophes in modern history. It is the 20th anniversary of the Boxing Day tsunami, otherwise known as the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, and it's also referred to as the Asian tsunami. It is the largest instantaneous death count in modern history. It's estimated within the first 10 minutes, 100,000 people were killed in northern Sumatra alone. The final death count after maybe an hour or more is approaching 250,000, 227,900 or something is the official number. And it affected over a dozen countries, killing people in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, Somalia, Myanmar, Maldives, Malaysia, Tanzania, the Seychelles, Bangladesh, South Africa, and Yemen. This was a huge catastrophe. And the reason the death toll was so high is because none of the people in this region were familiar with tsunamis in the sense that there was a huge threat of tsunami for all the people in the coastal regions. There was no tsunami warning system, and people in schools aren't even taught about tsunamis at all. So no one had any idea when it was happening. In fact, the people ran to the shore because they were fascinated by the water draining.
Well, I'll add too that it does seem like some of the local population was aware of what was happening, but you have to consider that how many tourists were in that area, like in Thailand and to some degree Sri Lanka, I think.
Yeah, so an amazing, devastating event. We'll go over everything that occurred there. And we'll also discuss the fact that this is not just a threat for the Indian Ocean and the people in the region of Indonesia. The biggest threat for tsunami for anyone is for Hawaiians. And that's because the island of Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific. 90% of all the earthquakes, large ones and small ones, occur on the Ring of Fire. And that's where 90% of all the volcanoes are, which can also cause tsunami due to landslide. And Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific. So any tsunami that's generated, Hawaii is going to be affected every time.
Yeah.
The good news is this earthquake happened on the other side, outside of the Ring of Fire. So Hawaii was not affected, but all of the areas in that region, including Africa, India, and all the islands down there in that island arc, were all smashed quite hard.
Yeah.
So we'll get into all the details. But first, we're going to talk about the headlines that have been circulating about the Parker Solar Probe and how it has touched the sun. Now, did it actually touch the sun? Probably not. The problem is that, like you pointed out earlier to me, is that they're not describing the sun as the sun and the solar environment. The solar environment meaning they have assigned an atmosphere to the sun extending up to 8 million miles from the surface.
Right.
And they're currently halfway in there, around 4 million miles away.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know exactly. I mean, the size of the atmosphere of the sun, the corona, right, is going to vary. So some people say 5 million miles, some say 8.5 million miles, but this probe reached 3.8 million miles. So you could certainly say that it was inside the atmosphere of the sun, thus justifying saying that it touched the sun.
Yeah, I don't buy that. See, if I'm a spacecraft and I'm flying by Earth and I come into the atmosphere at, let's say, 150,000 feet and fly by, at no point was I ever touching the Earth.
Right. But you know, to be fair, considering how hot the corona can get, it's a pretty spectacular development.
Yeah, and for some reference, here is the Parker Solar Probe touching the sun. You can rewatch tonight and see all the visuals that we share during the radio show amongst ourselves here. Now, the Parker Solar Probe was designed to be very unique in the fact that it has a huge heat shield, which you can't see. It's on the other side of the satellite here. It's the big plate you see on the far end.
Apparently made of carbon foam.
Yeah, it faces the sun the whole time, which allows the instruments that we're looking at here to remain around room temperature. So it's being blasted. It's not that hot at 3.8 million miles away. It's like 1,700 degrees.
Well, so I'm really confused about this, right? Because um so, so I'm reading in some places, right, that the corona can reach 3.5 million degrees Fahrenheit, but
Yeah.
that the upper solar atmosphere reaches or can exceed 1 million degrees Fahrenheit, and this shield is only designed to reach 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm a little confused about how this works.
Yeah, well, we're not looking at the sun here. This glowing spot is that hot spot, the hot part of the atmosphere that's 1 million degrees. So what we would say is the surface of the sun, what we're looking at here, that's the 1 million degree part. The surface of the sun actually isn't what we're looking at. It's way below this
No, I'm
upper.
talking about the
Oh,
corona, the atmosphere.
yeah.
The media article published about this specifically says that the upper solar atmosphere called the corona can exceed 1 million degrees Fahrenheit.
That's the glowing stuff we're looking at that we call the sun. So they're above that here. They're 3.8 million miles away from the 1 million degree section of the sun.
But wouldn't that be the upper solar atmosphere?
No, that's the problem. That's why they're not mentioning it, because it's the definition of touching the sun is nonsense. They're not. They're 3.8 million miles away. They just want to appear as if they're in the solar atmosphere. I don't know what that means. If you're here where the Parker Solar Probe and you look out into space, you're going to see stars. It's not like the sky will be blue when you get close to the sun, because
No,
you're in
I
the
understand that, but if
atmosphere.
the corona is 5 million miles and away from the surface of the sun, and this thing is 3.8 million miles, it's within the corona.
I don't think so. I think that the surface that we're looking at, the glowing area here, is 5.8 million miles from the surface of the sun. This red stuff that we call the sun is above the surface, 5 million miles.
I know.
And
Isn't
so
that the
the
corona?
probe is now an additional 3.8 million miles away from that.
Okay. So I don't know if that's a media article thing, because they're specifically stating the distance of the probe is from the surface of the sun, not from the corona.
Yeah, that's incorrect.
Huh.
That is totally
It has
incorrect.
to be. It has to be just simply because of the temperatures that this shield is designed to withstand.
Yeah, they're minimal. So let's throw out some examples. Mercury is the closest planet. It's 35 million miles away from the sun. This thing is just 4 million miles away. Mercury's average temperature is 800 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is so much closer. And yet, according to the scientists, it's only the plate, the heat shield is only reaching 17 or 1800 degrees, which is, you would think it would be much higher.
Right.
If 35 million miles away, Mercury is 800 degrees.
Right.
Yeah, I don't get it. But it might have something to do with the fact that this probe is moving the fastest that any object created by humans. Here's what's unique.
Well, wait. Let me throw something else in there too before you get there. Because so I was thinking the same thing, that it may have to do with the speed that this object is moving as well as its path, right? It's in an elliptical orbit around the sun. So it's getting in relatively close proximity and then leaving again. So maybe that is part of what's keeping the temperature to a reasonable level.
And plus the speed, 430,000 miles an hour, might be cooling it down.
Right.
And what's interesting is if you just put a shield in front of your face when you're close to the sun, on the other side of the shield, it's freezing cold. It's space. It's very cold. So that's kind of what happens when they make this thing.
Yeah, they're saying that the equipment is being basically kept at room temperature, which is like, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that. Like, really?
Right, because if you're in what they call the atmosphere of the sun, it's going to be very hot because 35 million miles away, Mercury is burning up. How is this only 1,700 degrees and the instruments are at room temperature? Doesn't make much sense. What's unique is this is the closest we've ever come to a star. And it's the fastest any man-made object has ever traveled. Just a very unique set of circumstances here. I wonder why we're not developing a program to go to a nearby star. We have lots of stars that are close by. just a few light years away,
Mm-hmm.
which means at a very high speed, you could get there in a decade or so.
Right.
So I don't know why we're
Well,
probably waiting for a warp drive, which we
I mean,
probably already have.
right. I mean, somebody's probably working on it, right? I mean, considering this is our first venture this close to a star, and I find the design of this whole thing is pretty, pretty ingenious, like particularly the elliptical orbit, which allows this probe to get away from the heat for a while. And part of the result of that is that, when it's in a position such that the sun itself is sort of blocking our communication with it, it's like, it's like not even there, so we don't even know if it's functioning. But also the heat and the radiation prevents communication from happening when it's at its closest point. So it's kind of neat. Like this just reemerged 2 days ago. Only 2 days ago did we know that the probe was still functioning,
Yeah,
because it emerged from that close proximity.
Yeah, this artist representation of the close flyby was Christmas Eve, and it wasn't until December 26th. Scientists waited for like 41 hours until they got a ping.
Right. Right.
And so the plan is to keep whipping this baby by the sun again and again and again until it no longer functions.
Yeah. Well, also to answer your earlier question about why aren't we designing something to study other close stars, I mean, I think part of the answer is how they got the probe there in the first place and into position, right? They had to do, what was it, 6 or 7 flybys of Venus in order to get it into this orbit and at this speed. So
yeah, the problem was shifting the angular momentum to get it into the right orbit, and it was I believe a Chinese female scientist that made the calculation.
Yes.
And they were flabbergasted. They were like, wow, solved. So they changed the angular momentum by doing what you just said, flying around Venus in a particular orbit, and then slingshotting it towards the sun.
Right. So considering we had to do all of that, do 7 flybys just to get it into position, illustrates how much difficulty I think we would have getting a probe to another star that's, a light year away or so.
It would have to be several. There's nothing within a light year.
Right.
All right. So the solar probe is the fastest human-made object, and it just touched the sun. Or did it? Probably not. So that's about all we have to say about that.
Yeah, see how flying a mere 3.8 million miles above the sun's surface.
Right, and we consider the surface of the sun the corona, which is incorrect because the surface is below there. It's the black hole that's a sunspot that we're looking into the sun.
Yeah.
So it's, again, what we know from all of these articles is that the people writing them don't know the basic science, right?
No,
that's why
they don't.
We've got all this bad information on climate, and now we're touching the sun.
Well, and as I said to you earlier, that not one of these media articles that I've seen gives the proper context. Like it doesn't give the background information for how big the corona is, what we're actually considering the surface, nor does it even bother to mention that the sun itself is like 864,000 miles wide. Like that's kind of important to wrap your head around. I mean, that gives context to, let's say, to the size of the corona, right? Which is somewhere between 5 and 8.5 million miles wide, which is crazy.
The sun is crazy. And the fact that we don't know anything about the sun makes it even crazier.
Right.
The current model and cosmology of our sun is a thermonuclear reactor that's eventually going to burn out of fuel. And as it burns out of fuel, it expands. And then it finally, in its death knell, which they have a date for, it's like 7.4 billion years from now, the sun will die. It explodes. But first it expands so wide that it will engulf all of the inner planets. That's how big this star is estimated to get. The problem is that whole story might be a fairy tale.
Yeah.
And stars may be individually unique in the sense that they don't really expand or grow or burn out. They're simply nodes on a Birkeland current in a Z-pinch. So they're the Z-pinch node of the Birkeland current, which would create, and this has been created in a lab, the Z-pinch creates a plasmoid. And so the sun may be a plasmoid.
Yeah. Well, we don't even understand very well. We're starting to, but supposedly understand very well why the corona is actually hotter than the surface of the sun. There's so much that has not been explained by our current model.
Right. And if you think of those crazy Spencer plasma balls,
Yeah.
it's the plasma that's hot, and the plasma is sitting on the surface of the black sphere in the middle.
Right.
So the black sphere is cold, where the surface is plasma, hot, burning hot. So a similar thing, I think, is happening with our sun.
Therefore, not a thermonuclear factory.
No, it's really a bizarre electrical reaction in a Birkeland current. That's all these stars are.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have unlimited energy flowing through the universe, you need discharge points. I think
Mm-hmm.
you can't just, it can't just continuously flow. And these discharge points are suns. And then the debris around these suns or stars is where life is. Isn't it weird?
Mm-hmm.
Where
Yeah, that's an
life
interesting way of
forms
looking at it.
on the tiny specks of debris circling stars.
Right. Tiny, truly tiny.
Yeah, because of the size of the sun, this Parker Solar Probe is like a grain of sand versus the Earth. I mean, it's literally that's the scale.
Yeah.
And so think of how fragile it is at that close proximity. I think what's going to happen is some space weather event is going to take out the probe, not the heat.
Right.
If the probe is in the wrong place at the wrong time and there's a coronal mass ejection, every
It's
single
toast.
electronics is going to fry. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm very curious to see how long this thing lasts.
Yeah, we've got satellites in Lagrange points that we, the SOHO satellites, they're
Mhm.
far away from the sun and they get destroyed.
Yes.
So this is walking on eggshells right here.
Yeah.
Anything else we should touch on here?
No, I still think it's very cool.
Yeah, indeed. All right, let's we went over all the stats. There's nothing left in here. Yep. There's a really great video that we will link you below to here, which basically has the history of the Parker Solar Probe. If you didn't know, it was in 1958 that it was first posited that they create this probe. They create a probe to go to the sun, and it wasn't until 2023 or 2024 that we went there.
Again, answering your question as to why we're not exploring nearby stars.
Yeah, it took 70 years to get a satellite to our star.
Right. Well, just think about the differences in like materials science today than what was going on in the 50s, right? You absolutely need that to do this, to design a heat shield that can protect this probe adequately from the heat.
Yeah, we have sent probes much earlier to Venus, and what they melted. We actually made it to the surface for a few seconds, but then the thing melted.
Right.
It shows you how extreme other planets can be, and how powerful the sun is. And the fact that we don't use the sun as the main driver of climate on Earth is beyond me. That's the stupidity of science that we're dealing with.
Right. I mean, this whole story, I think, does a pretty good job of illustrating the sheer size and power of the sun. And then think about, I mean, that's just one star in a star of probably in a universe of infinite stars, probably. It's like it's very hard to comprehend how extraordinarily large everything gets.
Right. And our star is tiny. It's one of the smallest stars that are out there, other than brown dwarfs.
Right.
There are stars that are 1,000 times bigger than our star, which just blows your mind apart.
Right.
Now, there are people claiming that the whole purpose of the Parker Solar Probe is to go up to the sun to determine when the micronova is going to happen. Which makes zero sense, because what would be the evidence they're looking for? If we get close enough to the sun, we'll find like a notebook or a checklist on when the next flare is. It's absolutely, it's idiocracy.
Well, it's also idiocracy. It's a stupid idea in the sense that all of this does illustrate how little we know. I mean, like, this is an amazing accomplishment, and I don't want to poo-poo it. But, considering everything that it also shows how much we don't know and how much we don't know how to do.
Baby
Like I said, like
steps.
I always say, the more I know, the more I realize I know nothing at all, right?
Right. And the reality is that at some point in the future, everything that we know is going to be erased from humanity's memory.
Yeah, that
It's
too.
the amnesia that we suffer. Um, and that is a great segue to the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, which is the largest catastrophe in modern history that we've witnessed and recorded using modern instruments. It killed almost 250,000 people in less than a day in 14 countries. And this is not even a large tsunami.
Yeah.
There are tsunamis that we know of that can be up to 10 times larger than this, which occur from not earthquakes, but from volcanic landslides.
Mhm.
So there's multiple ways you get tsunamis. You can have displacement of the ocean floor through an earthquake, causing a bulge, a tidal bulge, which then becomes a tsunami. You can have a huge landslide that enters the ocean, pushing a wall of water forward, which then creates a tsunami. And then the one we've been talking about for years is the impact tsunami. That would be unimaginable because if you have the big enough object, literally, I think I forget what the name of the crater is, Burkle crater.
Yeah.
Burkle crater is estimated to be this several thousand-foot object that hit the ocean, displaced the entire ocean. It made it all the way to the seafloor, which is 3,000 feet deep. That would create a 3,000-foot tsunami.
Well, no, it would actually be bigger than that
Yeah.
because, as one sort of model I was looking at rightly points out, so if you have an earthquake-induced tsunami, they're not necessarily that easy to detect because while there's a wave, the wave isn't necessarily that much different from a normal wave. The problem is when you start reaching a shoreline and the ocean floor is not nearly as deep, the water is running into that ocean floor, so it's pushing the water up even higher. So it would be the same for an impact tsunami, that once the water approaches shore, that crest is going to be far higher than it was out in the ocean.
Yeah, which is good news for the West Coast. And we're going to get to the Cascadia subduction zone. The good news for the West Coast, you've been there, you've been at the ocean there. It
Many
is
times.
not like the East Coast. It drops straight off. The water is freezing cold. So the tsunami that hits the West Coast is not going to have much time to develop. It will be more like a rapid wall of water, keeping the wave amplitude lower. That doesn't mean that less people will die.
Right.
The run-in is still the same based on the elevation. So even though the tsunami deposit from 1700, let's say in Washington state, is only 4 inches of sand, that doesn't mean that everyone wasn't killed that was on the coast. They were.
Right.
They were all washed into the ocean. The bad news is for the East Coast. We have a continental shelf that goes out 250 miles.
Yeah.
That is the entire buildup of the tsunami wave.
Yeah.
It will start building 200 miles offshore as more and more water pushes onto the back of it, and it could create an unimaginable wave for the East Coast. A big enough tsunami would be higher than all of the buildings in Manhattan.
Right.
That just like the movies.
You know, it's funny because, okay, so I was watching this, I think I sent it to you, watching this footage from the 2004 tsunami that was recorded by a German tourist. And, everybody, like, he's filming this wave coming in way out. And, everybody's just kind of looking at it like, what is that? And just standing there. Because, from that distance, it doesn't seem like much. It just looks like something weird. And if you're not familiar with what a tsunami is, you're just going to stand there and watch it like out of curiosity. So he's filming this thing coming in for quite a while before it becomes clear that he needs to run for it,
Yeah, there's a battleship out there, and it literally gets tossed like a toy.
Right.
And that's when it hits him.
Right.
Oh, my goodness.
That's when he's like, oh, wait a second. Because you can't tell from that distance how destructive it is. It just looks like a white line, It doesn't really look like much.
Yeah, and people are like, oh, that looks like a 10 to 20-foot wave. But the reality was that the Boxing Day tsunami wave reached 98 feet.
In some places, yeah.
Yeah. Well, northern Sumatra, right at the close proximity to where the earthquake was.
Yeah, right. And probably Thailand was probably close.
Yeah. And even though it took another hour to get to India and other places, it's still moving 500 miles an hour. And even if it's 30 feet when it gets to you, that's no good either. We're talking a tropical area. 30 feet is, there's nowhere in Florida that's 30 feet above sea level. It's all 25 feet above sea level.
Right. There's like literally nowhere to escape to.
There's a few hills. The highest place in Florida is just like 300 feet above sea level.
Right. Right.
And you can't put all the citizens on that hill.
No. You know, and I think the other problem here is that, and I don't think it's stupidity. I think it's just a human perception thing, that people forget sometimes how, well, maybe it is stupidity, how powerful water is. You know, even if it's not that high, like water rushing in from the ocean is extremely powerful. Like you stand no chance against that.
Yeah, and this is too big to even look at.
It's very zoomed in.
You can see the debris here and the destruction. Yeah. There is no way anyone survived that was here.
Yeah.
And so you can see why the death toll was so high.
Yeah.
Even if these people knew a tsunami was coming, where are they going?
Right. Right.
It's going to take you a while to get up to this hill.
Well, and, you know, depending on where you were exactly, some people did this. I was watching this documentary about this day from like 5 years ago with very badly robot narrated. It's really strangely bad robot narration. Anyway, you know, there's a lot of original footage in it. And, you know, in some places, that's exactly what happened. You know, some people went straight for a mountain or a hill and they just ran for their lives, you know, and there's groups of people that certainly made it, but it's almost extraordinary that anybody made it through this in a way. I remember this day really well because I was like at my in-laws' house, my former in-laws' house, and it was just devastating to hear about this.
Yeah, it's right before Christmas or right after Christmas.
It was Boxing Day, the day after.
And so I can't get out of here. Oh, right, I did it. So what we're looking at here is a village near the coast of Sumatra after the tsunami struck here. So this is one of the hardest hit regions, which is obviously why it looks devastated. It was
the largest number of deaths as well.
Yeah, it was one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded in modern times, estimated to be a high 9.2. And so they give it a range 9.2, 9.3, with an epicenter about 80 miles off the coast. Now, a tsunami wave travels at 500 miles an hour. How long is it going to take to get there? It's just 10 minutes. So even if they had a warning system, I don't think it would have saved many lives. It would have saved tens of thousands of lives. The people that were close to high areas would have escaped, but everyone else would have been dead trying to escape.
And most people, unless they had already experienced a tsunami, they're going to hesitate initially, even if there was a warning system, right? They're going to hesitate. Yeah. People don't, you know, it's like you can scream tsunami, tsunami at someone and they're going to go, what? Really? What is that? You know, it's just, yeah. You don't have a lot of time to react.
There's the location. Right off the western coast of Indonesia, Sumatra. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Asia and the most powerful earthquake in the 21st century. In the 20th century, we had a very strong 9.2, I think, in Alaska in 1969. And it's the third most powerful earthquake ever recorded in the world since seismographs were invented in 1900.
Right.
It is the longest fault rupture ever observed. 1,300 kilometers were ripped on the seafloor. That's almost 800 miles of fault moved. That's crazy. Yeah. It is also the longest duration faulting ever observed and the longest duration earthquake. It lasted just under 10 minutes at 9.2.
Wow.
People were crying, sitting on the ground. I mean, it must have been terrifying. After the 5th minute of 9 magnitude shaking, you still have got 4 more minutes of it.
Yeah.
At this point, halfway through, every building has collapsed, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it just seems like it will never end.
Yeah.
It caused the planet to vibrate as much as 10 millimeters during the event.
Mm.
It also remotely triggered earthquakes across the globe, including Alaska,
Hmm.
which is nowhere near Sumatra.
That's
But if the
interesting.
Earth is vibrating at 10 millimeters because of this earthquake, you think that any fault line that's about to go is going to go.
Well, that's interesting.
And I
Like
wonder
I'm
if there
thinking
were
it.
any eruptions too.
Right. 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 I'm thinking about it like in the context of expanding Earth theory. So let's say like you have an earthquake on the Ring of Fire this large that triggers other earthquakes. That could sort of give a slight explanation or a mechanism for how expanding Earth might work. You know, that there's
Yeah.
like a domino reaction.
Yeah, like there's some initiating event which causes everything to move and then it to expand.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we've posited that, right? Like a large impact may trigger new phases of growth.
Yeah. Perhaps.
Now, the original numbers for this quake were not 9.2, 9.3, which I find interesting. It
Oh.
took a while to get to that. So the original documentation is having a magnitude moment of 8.8,
Hmm.
which is significantly less than 9.2, because remember, each tenth you go up is a magnitude of 100.
Yeah.
So 8.8 is very low. Interestingly enough, in 2012, there was a similar magnitude earthquake in a similar region of Sumatra, but it wasn't on the subduction zone.
Oh wow.
And everyone thought that they were all going to die again and a tsunami was coming, but no waves came.
Yeah.
And that all has to do with where the fault is occurring. This was
Sure.
a transform fault. Do you know what that is?
No.
It's a lateral slip. So it's just moving left and right, not up and down.
It's not a. It's not a subduction.
Subduction is a transform fault where things go up and down.
Yeah.
And so this wasn't on that plate boundary. It was intraplate in the middle of the plate. And there was stress that built up. And so left-right lateral sliding occurred on faults that emerged.
Okay.
So what they think is that it was the 2004 subduction event earthquake
That
that
created
led to
more
the
pressure.
stress in the plate. And it took, how long? 8 years for it to finally rupture.
Oh, interesting. And then so that creates new faults. Because that's what you're saying.
Well, actually, the new hypothesis, so this is called the Astro-Indian plate. They think that these cracks forming are a new subduction zone forming, and there's going to be two plates that form. The Australian plate will subduct under the Indian plate at this fault.
Oh, interesting.
And it's been going on. The pressure's been building for over 1 million years. So in another 1 million years, we may have a subduction zone here, which means there's going to be more earthquakes, more slip on the Sumatra subduction, and what? More tsunamis.
Yes.
And the good news is that they're installing tsunami warning systems in the Indian Ocean. The bad news is they went in about 10 years ago or more, shortly after the tsunami. The bad news is that this is like a third world country, and they do not keep up the maintenance on the tsunami system.
Yeah, my understanding was that by 2005, there were a handful of detection stations in the Indian Ocean, maybe like 5 or 7. But that still is going to depend upon an infrastructure to distribute the information from the detection sites after it's been analyzed. So it's like you get the detection station gets the information, then somebody has to analyze and look at it, and then they have to send it out, I guess, to government institutions, get a cell, text out or something. It needs to be totally automated for that to work.
Yeah, which is how it works on the West Coast.
Right.
They have a tsunami warning system for California, Oregon, Washington, all of British Columbia, and Alaska. So the entire West Coast. And it's triggered by abnormal buoys. So once you get a weird buoy movement, it just triggers the warning.
Mm-hmm.
One recently was triggered a few months ago. There was no tsunami, but the people got to high ground and they didn't care. I think it was in British Columbia. They said, we didn't care missing an hour of work because we didn't die.
Right. Right. That's awesome.
And it's
Maybe
like
because that's part
practice,
of the
right?
reason why people hesitate. Like, do I really need to interrupt my day? Like, if you have too many false warnings, it's going to become like the boy who cried wolf. And then people are like, well, I don't want to interrupt my whole day. Should I run? Should I not?
So we've got this simulation here. It begins with the rupture, the 1,800-kilometer rupture. There it is rupturing. And then after it, there is the displacement of the water. And it's moving at real speed here. So it doesn't take much time to get everywhere.
Right.
And you can see why people died here in Sri Lanka and India, in all the regions that it hit rapidly.
Yeah.
I mean, it pushes its way all the way into the strait here.
Yeah.
So just because you're around the corner doesn't mean you're spared.
No, not at all. And also the level of devastation you're going to see is tremendously impacted by, like, okay, so to the east of Madagascar, there's this chain of like little islands that right now, like, it breaks this wave up a lot.
Which saves Madagascar.
Right.
But not so much for this coast here in Africa.
Although it's interesting that South Africa had some significant damage as well, because I don't really see that in this model.
Maybe it's the waves that just miss the tip
Well, right,
here.
that's what I thought, but then I'm watching this and there's clearly still a tsunami occurring. It's just not as high as it is elsewhere.
Well, yeah, you could see this wave front now coming in.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be as significant or as high, but even if you have a 3-foot tsunami, like we did with Hunga Tonga, the tsunami created by that for the island on the other side in Tonga, it was small. It was like a 4-foot tsunami. It still sucked people in the ocean and killed them.
Yeah. I'm a little confused by the color coding on this in this model, because the top end of the model says greater than a meter. The tsunami was clearly much larger than that. It's weird, isn't it? I was looking at that earlier.
It's the wave
going,
amplitude. What? Yeah. So that's the problem with tsunami detection, because out here in the ocean, the wave isn't big.
Right. That's what I was saying earlier in the show.
I think that they determined the wave amplitude here when it began was 9 meters. So it was only a 9-meter wave out in the ocean, but it was 100 feet high when it hit.
Right, but still, this coding only goes up to a meter.
Yeah,
I don't know what that's about, but anyway,
it's a simulation.
Right.
It's a simulation. And here we can see there is tsunami wave amplitudes greater than a meter is all the pink. So this is where most of the people died. Here.
Definitely greater than a meter.
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some of the lowest amplitude are down here on South Africa, where you just, oh no, that's pretty big. A half a meter to 7.5.
It's less around Australia and behind Madagascar. Well, see, look how it's interesting. Even on the western edge of Madagascar had a wave too, right? Because the water is going to go around and still come up on the other side.
Yeah, we can get right there. Oh, where is it? You can even see it starting to travel down along the coast there.
Yeah.
See, it's almost changed direction there.
For our listeners that don't have video right now, if you join us tonight on YouTube on Magnetic Reversal News at 8 p.m. Mountain Time, you can see what we're looking at.
Yeah, and we will link you to the video of the tsunami.
Yeah.
So they established an Indian Ocean tsunami warning and mitigation system, which is good news. The bad news is, like I said, they're not keeping it up. It says right here. Well, let's read this. This is the world's worst disaster of the 21st century. This is a paper. It has been well over 100 years since a major tsunami had struck the Indian Ocean, an event lost from living memory. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So for the West Coast, the periodicity of tsunami is even greater. It's 250 years.
Right.
So no one remembers on the West Coast of the U.S. tsunamis.
Right.
Because the last one was in 1700.
Right. That's the problem. That's why you get people standing on the beach, stupidly staring out at this white line, like going, what's that? Instead of running.
It's interestingly around the same time. Christmas is January 26th.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that weird?
Interesting.
So nobody in this region even knows about big tsunamis. It hadn't been one for 100 years. And then it hit on one day after Christmas in 2004, 230,000 dead. So they install the tsunami warning system. But what it says here is the Indian Ocean now has a tsunami warning system, but it is being seriously neglected. What that portends, no one knows yet. I mean, what it
That would
portends
suggest that nobody is sitting there watching the data as it's coming in, right? Because you need that. You need somebody to analyze the data as it arrives before you send out a warning.
Yeah, it's probably not automated either.
Right.
And
well,
it's
I got
being seriously neglected.
Yeah.
And this is in 2021, so it's
Right.
probably in even more neglect.
Right. Right. Huh.
All right, so what are the implications for us? Well, we live in North America, and let's talk about the Cascadia subduction zone. The 1700 Cascadia earthquake occurred along the Cascadia subduction zone on January 26, 1700, with an estimated moment magnitude of 8.7 to 9.2, exactly like the Boxing Day tsunami.
Yeah.
The megathrust earthquake involved the Juan de Fuca plate from mid-Vancouver Island south along the Pacific Northwest coast as far as Northern California. The plate slipped an average of 66 feet along the rupture, which was about 620 miles long, 1,000 kilometers, about a little more than half the size of the rupture in Sumatra. But massive. That's 620 miles of fault moved 66 feet.
Yeah, that's huge.
And so that can easily, if it's up and down, what happened in inland in Washington state is the ground dropped 8 feet. This created a hole. So a tsunami is now coming. The coast is 8 feet lower, which is going to make the ocean rush in anyway, plus a wave.
Yeah.
So it completely changed the topography of the west coast of the U.S. completely. Yeah. Where people's houses all was now below the tidal zone. So it's not like you could rebuild. They're in the ocean now. So this is a huge event. The good news is that there were very few people here, just Native Americans. There were no cities, towns, or infrastructure.
Well, and also on the West Coast, lots of places have like a cliff, like you're not really sitting at sea level a lot of the time. But like you said, the ground also sunk. So.
Yeah, and there are lots of coastal regions in Washington and Oregon.
Right.
That don't have cliffs.
Right.
Because we had massive floods that washed out to the ocean during the end of the Ice Age, and they create huge coulees and valleys. And so these tsunamis up in those states can run inland for miles up these river valleys. And then the same in reverse, the volcanoes, when they erupt, can send huge flows down those valleys into the cities, into the ocean.
Also potentially creating another tsunami.
Yeah. This is the worst place anyone could ever choose to live, period.
Yeah.
So I don't recommend it. The earthquake, in this case in 1700, caused a tsunami, which struck the west coast of North America and also the coast of Japan, which means that it also hit Hawaii. Japanese tsunami records, along with reconstructions of the wave moving across the ocean, put the earthquake at about 9 p.m. Pacific time on the evening of 26 January 1700. So it happened in the dark. That's even more terrifying. You wouldn't even know.
Yeah, you don't even see.
You'd probably hear the ocean get quiet because it would pull out, and you'd be like, how come I can't hear the ocean?
Oh, that reminds me. In this documentary I was watching, I thought this was so fascinating. There was a group of elephants. They were kept elephants. They had elephant keepers. And the elephants, before, I'm assuming maybe after the earthquake, but before the tsunami, maybe it was before the earthquake because animals sense a lot of things. Anyway, they were all of the elephants were chained, and they broke their chains and they started heading to higher ground. So the elephant keepers just followed them, and that saved their lives.
How long before?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it was after the earthquake. That would make sense. But the elephants seemed to know that the result was going to be a tsunami because they went
To
up a
higher
mountain.
ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were
Well,
determined to
elephants
do
have been
so.
around for quite a few more million years than humans.
Right. And they're
So
very
they must
smart.
know.
Yes, clearly they do.
So the most important clue linking the tsunami in Japan and the earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest comes from tree ring studies. For a while, they thought that the historical accounts didn't match because there was no dates on the Japanese tsunami, blah, blah, blah. But subsequent dendrochronology, which showed several ghost forests of red cedar trees in Oregon and Washington, killed, like I just explained, by lowering of coastal forests in the tidal zone by the earthquake.
Mm.
So literally whole forests dropped down now 6 feet or so below sea level, and then they were inundated by tidal muds because inland you don't get a lot of sand. You've walked in the bay in New Jersey. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
It's like 8 foot thick of clam poop,
Right.
and you lose your shoes in it.
Right.
So they did link this. This was a Pacific-wide tsunami, 1700. No one knows how many people it killed. I'm sure it was a very high number. But the problem is, and here we can even look at that deposit. So there's that thin little tsunami deposit. Over here on the stratigraphy stick here, these sections are 6 inches, the white section. So you can see it's a small little layer here.
Yeah.
But what you had, look at this. There was dune sand and there was topsoil. This is where the trees were. So this is above the ground. And then a tsunami hits, and look what's on top of it, tidal mud. So then it's below sea level here the whole time.
Yeah.
Since the 1700 tsunami.
Fascinating.
And here's even fire pits used by Native Americans.
Right.
Which are probably not alive after this sand is laid down.
No.
So there definitely was casualties from this event. But what is the significance for us? The significance is that it is not over.
Well, you could argue that the Cascadia fault is rather overdue, for one, right? If it's roughly every 250 years that something like this happens.
It's every 500 years, it's greater than magnitude 9. And every 250 years, we have a above 8.5 magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see here that after large ruptures, like the 1624 rupture, you have smaller ones. Large, then small, large, then small, large, then small, large, then small, large, then small. It is a repeating pattern, large, then small, large, and small. And the last one was large. So the good news is that we'll probably get an 8.8 instead of a 9.2.
Right.
Which isn't really good news. Because it's just news.
It's just better news than it could be. That's all.
And you can also see in the last 6,000 years, there seems to be a lot more than previous.
Yeah. That frequency is definitely up.
Has increased. And this is the entire Holocene. So you can see how it might have been pretty difficult to get some civilization going on the West Coast.
Yeah.
It constantly gets destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And I can imagine there's tons of I didn't look into this, but Native American stories about these events.
If you back up to the article.
Which one?
What you were just looking at, no, where you just were previously, to go all the way over to your...
The wiki here?
I don't know if it was the wiki, but
right
it was
here,
the last thing you were on before that.
Here it says right here.
Okay, the oral traditions, yes.
The confirmation of their oral traditions about great earthquake has led many Aboriginal groups in the area to initiate projects to relocate their coastal communities to higher and safer grounds. So the people in British Columbia, the natives know that this happens.
They're in the, whatever the other thing you were looking at, I think that WordPress article, all the way to the right.
WordPress.
All the way to the right. Go all the way over to the right. You're right, tap that one. Yes. No, I guess not.
It's not an article. It's just a picture.
Okay. Well, anyway, it was mentioning that the oral tradition talks about an earthquake and an inundation of some kind. So while there's no written documentation, there is at least that. But again, this is a problem of human amnesia and this information being dispersed beyond a couple of generations. in order that people are aware that this happens. Otherwise, you just stand there dumbly looking at the white line coming towards you.
Right. And it's interesting. It's the Native Americans that once the science came out that confirmed the 1700 tsunami, they then petitioned the government to move their communities to higher ground.
Yeah.
They're the ones to start moving.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's because the white man has only been here since after the tsunami. So they don't have any oral traditions about how all their ancestors died. These people did. They found out that the tsunami happened in 1700. They said, yep, our stories are true. We got to get out of here.
Well, that's the other thing, right? Is that the native people, they trust their own oral traditions, whereas white people tend to look at that as like, oh, just some story that they tell their children that doesn't match up to reality, right? We consistently fail to recognize that these stories seem to generally document something of significance. It's not nonsense. It's like well, that's a whole nother story, but if you actually trust those oral traditions, then you would know, whereas Westerners tend to only trust what has been documented in a at least pseudoscientific form.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, so what we now know from the science is that when these events occur, inland land drops.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And it can drop 5 or 6 feet. What I just found is very interesting. Where did I just go? A 2004 study, I got to find this. Okay, I just moved up here. In a 2004 study, they found that the potential for relative mean sea level rise caused by subsidence of coastal lands, that's just all fancy words for what I just said. When an earthquake occurs inland, the ground drops.
Mm-hmm. Like specifically a earthquake caused by subduction, right?
On the Cascadia. So we're talking about this event, which would be the Cascadia rupture. Right. The paper in 2004 postulated that cities on the west coast of Vancouver Island, such as Tofino and Usualet, or however you say that, are at risk to drop 3 to 7 feet.
Wow.
Which means they're going to be below sea level. So the entire cities will be destroyed.
Wow.
Yeah. So the next time this happens, it's going to be very interesting. If technology still exists the way it does, we're going to have so much footage of the event. We're going to see land dropping feet, 3 to 6 feet, cities drop down and the ocean come in. And this isn't even the tsunami wave.
Right. That's
crazy.
Wow.
And so here is the periodicity of those and the timing of the quakes. And you can see here, we are at it's now 324 years.
That's like the longest gap that we've had in the last 6,000 years almost.
Right. And it's before 6,000, we get bigger gaps. That's it.
Right. Right.
And there's an average quake for all quakes, 246 years. And we are 100 years past that almost.
Right.
Which means, in my opinion, that in the next 2 decades or so, we may see this rupture.
Yeah.
Which is bad news for people on the West Coast, especially those in Washington and Oregon.
It's so interesting how, humans always settle on coasts because there's an abundance of food typically on coastlines, right? But that comes with significant dangers, no matter where you are.
It's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Find us tonight on Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube at 8 p.m. Mountain Time.
Listening to Revolution Radio.